Hey guys, tonight we're diving into some of history's most bizarre and forgotten jobs. Roles that will make you question everything you thought you knew. From gong farmers who collected human waste from toilets in medieval England, to food tasters who sampled the king's meals first to make sure they weren't poisoned. These jobs are as strange as they are shocking. But before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into these forgotten jobs. They came only after dark, not because they wanted to, but because no one else wanted to see them. When the streets emptied and the fires burned low in hearths, that's when they moved. Quiet, unseen, necessary. They were the gong farmers, the forgotten waste collectors of medieval England. Back then there were no toilets, no plumbing, no sewage systems, just wooden seats above deep pits that filled and filled and filled, and someone had to empty them. That someone descended into the darkness beneath homes, inns, and castles, into holes filled with human excrement, with only a shovel, a rope, and a very strong stomach. The word gong comes from the old word for going, not as in walking, but relieving oneself. So a gong farmer didn't till fields or grow crops. He harvested waste by hand, from cesspits, chamber pots, and public latrines. His tools were simple: a long-handled shovel, leather gloves if he could afford them, and wooden buckets. They worked at night because of the smell. It was unbearable even by medieval standards. The law forbade them from working in daylight. It was easier that way. No one had to see the job being done, or be reminded that it was needed. It was also, perhaps, a small mercy for the gong farmer himself. The night didn't smell better, but at least no one looked at him with disgust. Inside those pits, some 10 or 12 feet deep, there was no air, not really. Just thick, heavy gas, methane, ammonia, and the kind that kills with one breath too deep. Sometimes they didn't climb back out. They would collapse in silence, with no one around to help. Death came not with a sword or fire, but with rot and silence. And yet they kept doing it, night after night, bucket after bucket. The stench was permanent. It clung to their skin, their hair, their clothing. No matter how often they bathed, if they could find a stream or pay for a bathhouse, the smell returned. People crossed the street when they walked past. Children pointed. Shopkeepers refused to serve them. Their homes were pushed to the edges of the city, near swamps or dumping grounds. And yet, they made decent money. Sometimes more than a carpenter or a brewer. No one else wanted the job, and the cities couldn't function without them. It was dangerous, disgusting, and absolutely essential. That made it valuable, but never respected. The waste they carried didn't just vanish. It had to go somewhere. Some of it ended up in dumping grounds on the edge of town. Some was emptied into the river, fouling the same water people drank from. But much of it, disturbingly, was recycled, used as fertilizer in nearby fields, a dark circle of life. What left the body returned to the soil, and eventually to the table. In a world without germ theory, soap, or modern medicine, these men were walking disease risks. And yet, without them, disease would have spread even faster. Without their quiet, filthy labor, medieval towns would have drowned in their own waste. But no one thanked them. No songs were written, no gravestones carved. Just men in the dark, shoveling what everyone else wanted to forget. At first light, while the rest of the village was still asleep, A lone figure stepped into the marsh. Mist curled low over the water, hiding the mud beneath. With every step, their feet sank into the cold, sticky bog. This was not a place for anyone by choice, but for a leech collector, it was the start of another day. They didn't wear shoes. The leeches had to feel skin, warm, soft, and full of blood. That was the bait. So they walked barefoot, slowly, letting the creatures come to them. They stood still in the shallow water, waiting, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, and then they would feel it. The first bite, a small wet grip, then another, and another. Leeches latching on, feeding, swelling with blood. The collector would reach down, carefully pull them off, and drop them into a wooden bowl or glass jar. The goal was to get as many as possible before the pain or blood loss made it too much. This wasn't a rare or isolated job. In the 18th and 19th centuries, leeches were used everywhere, from village doctors to elite hospitals. They were seen as cure-alls for headaches, fevers, swelling, bad moods. People believed in bad blood, and taking it out meant health. One patient might need 20 leeches. A hospital, thousands every year. The demand never stopped, which meant neither could the collectors. Many were women, often widows, old and poor. Others were children, light enough to stand in the bogs without sinking too deep. No one cared who did the job as long as the jars were filled. But the job came at a cost. Repeated blood loss led to weakness, dizziness, and long-term damage. The bites often became infected. The water was full of bacteria, leech droppings, dead things. And then there were the other creatures. Eels, sharp reeds, biting insects. There was always something under the surface. Some collectors fed the leeches after catching them, to keep them alive during transport. That meant putting them back on their own arms, willingly, or finding a weak animal to bleed. This wasn't medicine. This was survival, dirty, desperate, and barely paid. When they finished collecting, they walked back with jars sloshing, full of creatures still squirming, still hungry. Their legs were covered in blood, their skin marked with rings of red, some still leaking. There was no praise, no thanks. Just another dirty coin, and the same work tomorrow. The irony was that these people helped keep others alive, nobles, priests, even royalty. But they themselves were always on the edge of sickness and death, forgotten by history, buried without names. Leech collectors stood in the mud and bled, so that others wouldn't have to. The streets were still dark. The lamps hadn't been lit. No cars, no voices, just fog drifting between the narrow alleys and chimneys that leaked smoke from 100 coal fires. But someone was already awake, long before anyone else even stirred beneath their covers. She carried a long stick, sometimes made of bamboo, sometimes just an old broom handle. Tucked into her coat pocket was a leather pouch full of dried peas. The job wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was barely noticed. But without her, factories would be empty, mills silent, and the day wouldn't begin. She was a knocker-up, a human alarm clock. Before electricity reached every home, and long before clocks were cheap or reliable, people needed someone to wake them up on time. Not at 6:05, not at 6:10, exactly 6 a.m. or earlier. People had jobs that started at dawn, and being late meant being fired, so they paid a few pennies a week for someone like her to make sure they never overslept. She'd learned every route by heart, who needed waking and when. Some wanted a gentle tap on the window. Others wanted 3 loud knocks on the upstairs pane. A few were heavy sleepers. For them, she used her pea shooter. It was a small, hollow pipe, like a straw, used to shoot dried peas at 2nd or 3rd story windows. She'd tilt her head, Take aim and tap, tap, tap. 3 quick hits on the glass. No damage, just noise. Just enough to make them stir, sit up, groan, and throw the covers off. She couldn't leave until she saw movement. That was the rule. Some would try to trick her, wave from the window and then fall back asleep. But she watched closely. No movement. Another knock. Another shot. Another whistle through the pipe. It didn't matter if it was raining or snowing, or if the wind cut through her coat like knives. She kept knocking. Sometimes it was still pitch black when she started. One morning she found a dead rat frozen stiff on a stoop. Another time a drunk man mistook her for a thief and threw a shoe at her. But she kept going. Most knockers up were women, though some were old men or even children. They were too old or too young for factory work, too poor to retire, too proud to beg. This job was all they had. It didn't pay much, but it was steady, and it mattered. At least for a while. They knew every secret of every neighborhood, who worked nights, who hated mornings, who always answered and who never did. In a way, they were the pulse of the early city, quiet, invisible, but essential. Of course, not everyone respected them. Some saw them as relics or as bothers. But even the most grumpy worker felt grateful when they arrived at the mill just in time to avoid a wage cut. Eventually, clocks became cheaper, electricity more common. Alarm bells were installed in workers' homes. One by one, the knocker-ups disappeared. Some became janitors, others retired. A few died in poverty, forgotten by the very people they used to wake. But for decades, in the dawn quiet of industrial cities, Manchester, London, Glasgow, they kept time not with gears or bells, but with a stick, a pea shooter, and a promise to knock until you opened your eyes. The bell rang once, a slow, hollow sound through the mist. It wasn't a church bell. It was a handbell. And it meant someone had died. In a quiet village somewhere in the Welsh or English countryside, a body had been laid out on a wooden table, or sometimes just on a bed. The family stood silently. No priest, no candles. Just one figure approaching from the trees, dressed in dark, worn-out clothes, and eyes that never quite met yours. He was the sin-eater. His job was simple to explain. He came to eat the sins of the dead. A piece of bread, maybe some salt, and a cup of ale were placed on the chest or face of the deceased. These weren't for the soul to enjoy in the afterlife. They were for him, the sin-eater. He would sit beside the body, sometimes say a quiet chant, sometimes nothing at all, then slowly eat the bread, sip the drink, and rise. With that act, it was believed he had taken in the sins of the dead. Every lie, every theft, every betrayal, every unspoken darkness now lived inside him. No one thanked him. No one made eye contact when he passed through the village later. He was both needed and shunned. They believed in his power, enough to pay him a few pennies and offer him stale bread, but feared what he had become. Because if you believed that sin could be passed through food, what did that make the man who ate it all? He didn't get rich. Far from it. Most sin-eaters were poor, very poor, living on the edges of society, sometimes homeless, always alone. He wasn't invited to weddings. He didn't sit at the tavern with the others. But when someone died, especially someone with a bad past, or no access to a priest, he was called. Nobody really knows where the tradition began. Some think it was pre-Christian. Others say it was a mix of superstition and desperation, but it lingered for centuries, especially in rural places where the church was far away, or where priests wouldn't bury someone who died in sin. What's more chilling is the weight of it, not just spiritually, but mentally. Imagine carrying the sins of dozens, maybe hundreds of strangers, never confessing, never cleansing, just eating. Again and again. Some sin eaters, it's said, began to look haunted, pale, thin, hollow-eyed. Others took to drink. A few vanished, but nobody followed. Nobody asked questions. Eventually, the practice faded. Priests regained control of death rites. Sin-eating was labeled heresy, superstition, even evil. But for generations it was very real. Not a story, not a myth, a job, a strange, lonely, uncomfortable job. And in those quiet cottages and forgotten graveyards, the sin-eater would walk back into the woods, full of bread, full of ale, and full of sins that weren't his. In ancient times, death was not just a personal loss, it was an event that echoed throughout the entire community. Funerals were elaborate occasions, filled with rituals designed not only to honor the deceased, but also to offer the living a chance to publicly express their grief. In this context, the role of the mourning woman emerged, a professional hired to cry, wail, and weep at funerals, particularly in ancient Egypt and Rome. The job of the mourning woman was not just about shedding tears. It was a deeply ingrained social role. In both cultures, mourning was seen as a communal act, and showing emotional loss in public was considered an important ritual to ensure the deceased's soul would transition peacefully into the afterlife. The mourning woman's presence was essential, ensuring that the rites were performed correctly and the grief of the living was properly acknowledged. In ancient Egypt, funerals were grand and sacred events. The Egyptians believed that the journey into the afterlife required not only proper burial rituals, but also emotional validation. The mourning woman, or sometimes a group of professional mourners, was hired to create a loud, expressive atmosphere of sorrow at the funeral. It wasn't just about crying in silence. It was about vocalizing grief in a way that conveyed respect for the deceased and the gods. Mourners would gather at the home of the deceased, crying loudly, pulling their hair and tearing their clothes. Their emotional outpouring was an essential part of the funeral, signaling to the gods that the deceased left behind people who deeply mourned them. They would cry out specific laments that praised the deceased and invoked blessings for the afterlife. The mourning woman's cries were thought to appease the gods, ensuring the deceased's safe passage into the afterlife. Sometimes, the professional mourner would take a more prominent role, leading the procession or standing by the tomb of the deceased to continue their wailing. This intense display of grief was seen as necessary to help guide the soul of the dead to its final resting place. Without it, the deceased might not transition smoothly. Egyptians believed that if the proper rituals were not observed, the soul of the deceased would be stuck in limbo, unable to find peace. In Rome, the role of the mourning woman was equally significant, though with slightly different cultural connotations. Roman funerals were formal occasions, and public grieving was considered crucial. While close family members could mourn privately, professional mourners were hired to ensure the public side of grief was fully expressed. Roman society was highly public, and funerals were no exception. They were events where the social standing of the deceased was showcased for all to see. The mourning woman, or praefika, was often called upon to sing laments and wail loudly in front of large crowds. The praefika would wear special garments, like a dark tunic, to distinguish her as a mourner. Her role was not only to express sorrow, but to encourage others to feel and display their emotions more openly. These professional mourners were usually women, as Roman society saw mourning as a feminine trait. Women were traditionally viewed as more emotional and more connected to the public expression of grief. However, it wasn't simply about crying on command. The mourning woman was a skilled performer. trained in how to deliver an effective lament that would stir emotions in those around her. Unlike the Egyptians, the Romans didn't believe that the mourner's wails were necessary for the deceased's passage into the afterlife. However, the proper public display of grief was still seen as an important reflection of the deceased's social value. A funeral without appropriate mourning was considered incomplete, even disrespectful. A well-executed lament could enhance the reputation of the deceased, especially if they were of high social status. The mourning woman's job was also economically driven. In both Egypt and Rome, they were paid for their services, which were highly valued in society. In Egypt, the mourning woman was part of a network of professionals who could be hired for various funerary rituals. In Rome, mourners were often hired by the family or funeral organizers, and the cost of their services was factored into the overall expenses of the funeral. This job could be quite profitable, especially in larger cities where wealthier families sought to ensure that their loved ones' funerals were grand and respectful. In both cultures, the mourning woman's role was not just emotional, it was a performance, blending the personal and the theatrical, to ensure the funeral was a memorable event for all involved. Over time, the role of the mourning woman gradually faded as societal views on death and grief changed. However, her legacy remains a fascinating reflection of how ancient cultures used public mourning to connect the living and the dead. In both Egypt and Rome, these women were the voices of grief, helping the community navigate the complex emotions that accompany loss. Their role was essential in the funeral process, ensuring that death was not just a personal event, but a collective experience that brought people together in shared sorrow. The professional mourners represented a blend of emotion and social performance, ensuring that funerals were not just an event for the deceased, but a shared ritual for the community. While the role of the mourning woman has long since disappeared, the traditions of mourning and remembrance continue to shape the way we honor those who have passed. In the past, the executioner's assistant played a critical and often gruesome role in the execution process. This position, though not as widely discussed or romanticized in history, was a vital one, especially in societies where public executions were part of the justice system. In many cultures, including medieval Europe and ancient civilizations, executioners' assistants helped in the preparation of the execution site, the maintenance of equipment, and in some cases, even the grim task of beheading. The role of the executioner's assistant was multifaceted and essential to the operation of public executions. These events were often carried out in a public square or a designated area where crowds gathered, and the assistant's job was to ensure that everything ran smoothly. The executioner was the central figure, but without their assistance, the execution would not have proceeded with the precision and order required. The assistant's duties were far from glamorous, and they often found themselves in the background, away from the public eye, but their role was no less important. One of the most crucial responsibilities of the executioner's assistant was the preparation of the execution site. This included setting up the execution platform, ensuring that the tools of the trade, whether an axe, sword, or guillotine, were in proper working condition. This often meant sharpening blades, inspecting ropes or chains, and making sure everything was ready for the grim task ahead. In some cases, the assistant would even be involved in holding the victim still or positioning them in a way that would allow the executioner to carry out their task efficiently. In more extreme cases, the assistant might even be called upon to help with the actual execution. While the executioner was the one who delivered the fatal blow, there were instances where the assistant would assist in securing the victim, or in some cases, assist with the decapitation. This could involve ensuring that the victim was positioned correctly, or if there was a miscalculation or failure in the execution, the assistant might be called to step in and complete the task. The assistant was often seen as a secondary figure, but when the executioner was unable to carry out the task, they would be relied upon to ensure that the process was completed. The role was one of cold efficiency, and while it might seem detached, it was also deeply tied to the societal views on crime and punishment. Executions were public spectacles, meant to deter others from committing crimes, and the executioner's assistant played a role in maintaining the authority of the justice system. This was a time when death sentences were often handed down for a wide range of offenses, from theft to treason, and the public execution was meant to reaffirm the power of the state and its ability to enforce its laws. For those who held the role of the assistant, it was often seen as a job with little to no respect, and in many cases, executioners' assistants were stigmatized by society. They were considered outcasts, often viewed as morally tainted due to their association with death and violence. The work was dirty, both literally and figuratively, and assistants were often treated as lower-class individuals, with little opportunity for advancement or social mobility. Despite the stigma, the executioner's assistant held an important place in the medieval and early modern justice systems. They were tasked with maintaining the order of executions, a duty that required a certain level of professionalism, precision, and at times, cold detachment. This role was integral to the public spectacle that executions had become, ensuring that everything from the site to the equipment to the execution itself went according to plan. The assistant might not have been the star of the show, but without them, the entire process could have fallen apart. Over time, as societies evolved and methods of punishment changed, the role of the executioner's assistant began to fade. Public executions became less common, and with the rise of more humane forms of punishment, the role eventually disappeared. But the history of the executioner's assistant remains a chilling reminder of how societies once dealt with crime and punishment, and the often unseen figures who made these dark tasks possible. The executioner's assistant may have been an unsung figure in the history of justice, but their work was a necessary part of a system that sought to enforce order through fear. In many ways, their role serves as a reminder of how punishment was carried out in the past, and how those who served in these positions often faced a life of isolation, stigma, and an unsettling closeness to death. In the past, personal hygiene was a complex and often uncomfortable task, especially for those of high social standing. One of the more peculiar and lesser-known jobs in history was that of the louse catcher. These individuals were employed by the wealthy and noble classes, whose lives were far from free of pests like lice. The louse catcher's primary responsibility was to remove these unwanted guests from the scalps and hair of nobles, ensuring that their patrons remained clean, comfortable, and free of the itching discomfort that lice can cause. The presence of lice was, and still is, a common problem in many societies. But during medieval and Renaissance times, it was particularly widespread due to poor sanitation and limited understanding of hygiene. While lice were a part of daily life for commoners, for the nobility, the idea of being seen with such pests was intolerable. To maintain their image of cleanliness and superiority, the rich relied on louse catchers to ensure they were free from lice infestations, which could cause embarrassment, itching, and even infection. Louse catchers, who were often women, would use their hands or specialized tools to carefully search through the hair of their noble clients. These tools could include fine-toothed combs or even specialized lice-catching instruments, all designed to remove the lice and their eggs, nits, from the hair. The process itself was time-consuming and required a great deal of skill and patience, as lice could hide deep in the hair and were difficult to remove. The job of a louse catcher was considered menial,
but it was also important in the social context of the time. Nobles needed to maintain a perfect appearance, and lice were seen as a sign of low status and poor hygiene. For this reason, the louse catcher's task was vital in preserving the dignity and reputation of the noble classes. The process would often take place in private, and sometimes the louse catcher would be invited into the homes of the wealthy to perform the task, creating a somewhat intimate and personal service. In addition to removing lice, these individuals might also help with general grooming, brushing the hair or applying oils to keep the scalp healthy and the hair looking its best. Interestingly, while the job may seem unremarkable today, it was one of the few ways for people, especially women, to earn money and find employment in an era when women were often limited to roles in domestic service. The louse catcher was in a unique position of trust with her clients, given the intimacy of the task at hand. This job could also lead to closer relationships with the noble families they served, and in some cases, louse catchers were even given gifts or small financial rewards for their service. Despite its importance to the upper classes, being a louse catcher was far from glamorous. The work was often performed in less than ideal conditions, with the risk of exposure to lice and other pests that came with the job. Lice catching could be physically exhausting and unpleasant, as the worker would spend hours meticulously combing through hair, often in dimly lit rooms or crowded chambers. The risk of infection, both for the louse catcher and their clients, was ever present, and sanitation was a constant concern. Over time, as bathing and personal hygiene improved in the later centuries, the role of the louse catcher gradually faded. The rise of more sophisticated personal care products, along with better understanding of cleanliness and disease prevention, rendered the job largely obsolete. Today, lice are still a common problem, particularly among children, but the job of the louse catcher has long since disappeared, replaced by modern treatments and medicated shampoos. The history of the louse catcher is a fascinating glimpse into the ways in which social status and hygiene intersected in the past. It was a job that, while lowly and often unappreciated, played a key role in maintaining the social fabric of the time. The louse catcher's work served as a reminder that, even in the upper echelons of society, the most mundane and unpleasant tasks were necessary to maintain appearances and ensure that social norms were met. It also shows how personal care was intertwined with class and status, with the nobility relying on specialized services to keep their image pristine, no matter the cost. In the darker, gramier corners of Victorian London, where the stench of the streets mixed with the dense fog, there existed a peculiar and rather dangerous profession, the tosher. Tosher, a term derived from the word toss, referred to individuals who ventured into the city's vast and often unsanitary sewer systems in search of valuable items that had been discarded or lost. The work of a tosher was not for the faint of heart. It required bravery, resourcefulness, and a high tolerance for filth and danger. These men, and sometimes women, were tasked with entering the smelly and hazardous underground tunnels of London's sewer system, armed with little more than a basic set of tools and a sharp eye for anything of value. Their primary goal was to search for precious items that had been discarded or lost, such as coins, jewelry, or other valuables that could be found among the refuse. London's sewer system during the 19th century was an extensive network of tunnels and drains, often built haphazardly to accommodate the rapid growth of the city. These tunnels were constantly flooded with waste, debris, and at times, valuable items that slipped down into the depths of the city's underground. For the toshers, this environment was both their workplace and their source of livelihood. Many toshers relied on the treasures they could uncover to make a living, as the rewards from finding discarded valuables could be significant. But the work was incredibly dangerous. The sewers were dark, damp, and filled with toxic gases. Rats and other vermin scurried through the filth, and the risk of disease was ever present. In addition to the risk of illness, Toshers had to navigate the maze-like tunnels, often crawling through narrow passages filled with waste and mud. There were also physical dangers, including the risk of getting stuck in the mud, being injured by broken debris, or even falling victim to the occasional collapsing tunnel. Despite the hazards, toshing became a livelihood for many impoverished individuals in London. With little other means of making money, they turned to the sewers as a way to survive. Toshering was often a last resort for those on the fringes of society, including the homeless and the destitute. It was a job that carried a stigma, and those who practiced it were often looked down upon by the more respectable classes. However, Toshers had a unique and critical role in the larger ecosystem of urban life. Their work helped keep the streets of London a little cleaner by removing debris from the sewers, even if they were doing so for personal gain. Toshers were also a part of a larger subculture of urban scavengers. In a city where the gap between rich and poor was widening rapidly, these individuals lived by their wits, eking out a living by scavenging everything from scrap metal to discarded personal belongings. In many ways, Toshers were an integral part of the social fabric of London, providing an odd but essential service to the city's functioning. As London's sewer systems became more modernized and sanitation improved, the role of the Tosher began to fade. The city's growing infrastructure made it harder to access valuable items buried in the sewers, and new technologies emerged to clean the city's drains more efficiently. By the early 20th century, toshing as a profession had largely disappeared, as better sanitation practices and sewer maintenance reduced the need for such scavengers. The legacy of the tosher, however, remains an intriguing reminder of the ingenuity and resilience of individuals living on the margins of society. Despite the filthy and hazardous nature of their work, toshers were able to find valuable treasures in the most unlikely places, surviving by navigating the city's underbelly. Today, the profession is a distant memory, but the stories of the toshers still echo through the streets of London, representing a unique chapter in the history of urban life.
In the royal courts of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where lavish banquets, opulent feasts, and intricate rituals were the order of the day, there existed a peculiar and often overlooked role, the herb strewer. These individuals were responsible for scattering fragrant herbs and flowers throughout the royal chambers to mask unpleasant odors, which, in the absence of modern sanitation and deodorants, were a common problem in grand palaces and castles. Life in the palaces of kings and queens was not as sanitized as one might imagine. With limited access to bathing facilities and no modern plumbing, the air in royal chambers could become quite foul. The combination of food waste, human waste, and the lack of proper ventilation led to an environment where the need for fragrant smells was paramount. The herb strewer's job, therefore, was to fill these spaces with fresh, sweet-smelling herbs, flowers, and spices that would help purify the air and create an atmosphere of comfort and luxury. The herb strewer's duties extended beyond simply throwing herbs onto the floor. They would carefully choose and mix various herbs, flowers, and even spices based on their aromatic properties. Common herbs included lavender, rosemary, thyme, and sage, all of which were known for their pleasant scents and medicinal qualities. The strewer would scatter these herbs in key areas, on floors, near hearths, and around sitting areas, where they would release their fragrances when crushed underfoot. Sometimes these herbs were even placed in decorative bowls or hung in bundles throughout the rooms. The task was not merely about aesthetics. It was deeply tied to the practical needs of the time. The herb strewer's work was essential for maintaining a tolerable atmosphere in the royal chambers, particularly during hot weather or after large banquets.
The herbs would not only mask the unpleasant smells, but were also believed to have medicinal properties. Rosemary, for instance, was thought to promote clarity of the mind, while lavender was believed to soothe the nerves and promote relaxation, ideal for a monarch in need of peace after a long day. But the herb strewer's role was not just confined to royal palaces. Their services were also in demand in large monasteries, courts, and even the homes of wealthy nobles, where the same issues with cleanliness and odor persisted. In these grand estates, the strewer was often a highly valued member of the household staff. They would be tasked with ensuring that the air smelled as fresh as possible, especially in rooms that were regularly used for entertaining guests, receiving foreign dignitaries, or conducting state affairs. In addition to their aromatic duties, herb strewers also played a role in maintaining health and wellness in a world where medicine was rudimentary. Many of the herbs they used were thought to have protective properties, guarding against illness and promoting good health. In an age when medical treatments were based largely on superstition and the limited knowledge of the time, the use of herbs for both their scent and their perceived health benefits was essential. Interestingly, the herb strewer was also a figure of some social importance within the royal court. While their job may seem menial today, the act of keeping a palace or castle smelling pleasant was vital to maintaining the dignity and reputation of the nobility. A stinky, foul-smelling royal residence would have been a source of embarrassment. So the herb strewer's ability to keep the air fresh and fragrant contributed to the grandeur and opulence of the court. As time passed and hygiene improved, particularly with the advent of more advanced sanitation practices in the 17th and 18th centuries, the role of the herb strewer began to fade. The arrival of modern perfumes, better waste management systems, and more frequent bathing rituals made the herb strewer's services less essential. However, the position remained a symbol of a time when cleanliness, at least in the form of smell, was a luxury reserved for the elite. The herb strewer's legacy endures, however, in the use of essential oils, potpourri, and even air fresheners that we use today. The fragrant world they helped create in royal courts was a precursor to the emphasis on aroma and ambiance in modern society. The herb strewer was more than just an individual who made the palace smell nice. They were a part of an intricate web of sensory experiences that contributed to the atmosphere of luxury and refinement in the world of medieval and Renaissance aristocracy. Their job, though no longer needed, reminds us of a time when the senses were crucial to the experience of opulence and nobility. During the devastating outbreaks of the Black Death in the 14th century and other waves of plague that ravaged Europe, one of the most iconic yet misunderstood figures to emerge was the plague doctor. With their long beaked masks and ominous appearance, these individuals became synonymous with death, disease, and the desperate measures taken to combat one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Despite their title, plague doctors were not necessarily trained physicians, and their methods were based more on superstition and trial and error than on any true understanding of the disease they were supposed to treat. The role of the plague doctor was born out of necessity. When the plague or bubonic plague struck, it spread rapidly, decimating entire towns and cities with terrifying efficiency. Traditional medical knowledge of the time was limited, and doctors had little understanding of how the disease spread or how to treat it. In response to this, cities and towns began appointing plague doctors, often individuals who had little formal medical training but were deemed fit to handle the overwhelming number of patients. Plague doctors wore a distinctive outfit that became their trademark. The most memorable feature was the long, bird-like mask, which had glass eye openings and a long, curved beak. The beak was typically filled with aromatic substances such as herbs, spices, or even vinegar-soaked rags. The belief behind this was that bad air, or miasma, foul-smelling toxic vapors, was the cause of the plague, and the herbs in the beak would purify the air, preventing the doctor from inhaling these noxious fumes. This idea was based on the theory of miasma, which was popular at the time, though it was far from the actual cause of the plague, which was later discovered to be bacterial and transmitted by fleas on rats. Plague doctors were often the last line of defense for those stricken with the plague. Their duties involved attempting to treat the sick, though their methods were rudimentary and largely ineffective by modern standards. They would use bloodletting, leeches, and sometimes boil lancing, all of which were common practices at the time but had little to no actual therapeutic effect on the disease. They also prescribed herbal remedies, though these were more based on folklore than scientific knowledge. In many cases, the plague doctor's job was less about healing and more about managing the inevitable. They were often the ones who performed the grim task of marking houses that had been infected, sometimes painting a large sign on the door or placing a flag outside to indicate that plague victims were inside. This was a way to isolate those who were sick from the rest of the population, a precursor to modern quarantine methods, though it was imperfect and often ineffectively enforced. In some instances, plague doctors were called upon to offer last rites, praying for the souls of the dead as they often found themselves surrounded by dying individuals. They were typically paid by the city or town for their services, but the payment was often minimal, given the high risk of contagion they faced. In fact, many plague doctors contracted the disease themselves, and their survival rate was low. In many ways, the plague doctor was as much a symbol of despair as a figure of authority in those dark times. Despite their limited success in treating the disease, the plague doctor's role was crucial in maintaining a semblance of order during times of extreme crisis. They provided a sense of structure in a world that was unraveling under the weight of death and fear. They became, for better or worse, the face of medical intervention in the age of the plague, even if the real solution to the crisis, the discovery of germs and antibiotics, was centuries away. As time went on and medical science evolved, the role of the plague doctor faded into obscurity. With the development of germ theory and advancements in hygiene and disease prevention, the knowledge that would eventually lead to better plague management came to light. Modern medicine, with its understanding of bacteria, viruses, and how diseases spread, would ultimately render the plague doctor's role obsolete. Today, the image of the plague doctor remains a haunting and iconic representation of a time when humanity grappled with a mysterious and deadly disease, armed with little more than superstition, fear, and primitive medical tools. The plague doctor, with their eerie mask and dark cloak, serves as a symbol of how far medicine has come and a reminder of the horrors humanity has endured throughout history. Though their methods were misguided, the plague doctors were nonetheless an essential part of the story of one of the darkest chapters in human history.
In the bustling cities of the past, particularly during the medieval and early modern periods, one job that was crucial, albeit unpleasant, was that of the rat catcher. As cities grew, so did the number of rats, and with them came a host of problems: diseases, contamination of food supplies, and destruction of property. The rat catcher's role was vital in controlling the rodent population, which, if left unchecked, could cause widespread illness and even death. These individuals were hired to eliminate rats from homes, businesses, and the public spaces of the cities, often working in the shadows to protect communities from the unseen dangers these pests posed. Rats were far more than just a nuisance. They were primary carriers of disease, particularly during times of plague outbreaks. The Black Death, for example, was spread by fleas that lived on rats, making the rat catcher's job not only unpleasant but life-saving. By keeping the rat population under control, they played an indirect role in reducing the spread of deadly diseases like the plague.
While they were not always equipped with modern pest control techniques or knowledge of the biological processes behind disease transmission, their work was crucial in preventing the most immediate risks posed by rats. Rat catchers, often working alone or in small teams, would use a variety of methods to capture and kill rats. Some would employ traps, simple contraptions made of wood or metal that could trap rats when they ventured inside. Others would use poisoned food, carefully laid out in areas where rats were known to frequent. In some cases, rat catchers would even use dogs or trained ferrets to hunt down and catch rats, using the animals' sharp senses and hunting instincts to track down and eliminate their prey. One of the most famous techniques employed by rat catchers was the use of rats themselves. Some catchers would release rats in an area and then follow the captured rats back to their nests, where they could eliminate entire colonies. This method, while effective, was time-consuming and required a great deal of patience, as rats are notoriously elusive and capable of quickly adapting to their surroundings. Despite the critical nature of their work, rat catchers were often seen as somewhat lower class and lived in the margins of society. They were often poor, and their work was dangerous, unpleasant, and unappreciated. Rats could be found in the sewers, under the floorboards of homes, in markets, and around the city's many waste piles. The rat catcher had to deal with these conditions regularly, facing the risk of disease and injury. The equipment they used was often rudimentary, and the chemicals or poisons employed could be hazardous both to the rat catchers themselves and to anyone else in the area. Additionally, the role of the rat catcher was intertwined with that of the public health system, such as it was at the time. In many cities, the rat catcher was appointed by local authorities to help reduce the risk of disease outbreaks. As public sanitation efforts slowly improved in the 17th and 18th centuries, the work of the rat catcher became even more essential. Cities began to implement more sophisticated systems for waste disposal, but the ever-present risk of rats continued to demand the services of these brave individuals. In some places, rat catchers gained a kind of fame. In 18th century London, for instance, a rat catcher named Jack Black became particularly well known. He reportedly cleared the streets of London of tens of thousands of rats. Rat catchers like him were often paid by the number of rats they brought in, and their work was sometimes recognized with public accolades or rewards, though this recognition was rare compared to the esteem afforded to other types of tradesmen. With the advent of modern pest control methods in the 19th and 20th centuries, the role of the rat catcher began to fade. New technologies, such as poison gases and more effective traps, rendered traditional rat-catching techniques obsolete. The development of the modern sanitation system and improved waste management reduced the availability of food sources for rats, which also led to a decrease in their populations. Today, professional pest control services and exterminators perform the work that rat catchers once did, with far more scientific knowledge and advanced tools at their disposal. However, the rat catcher's job remains an important part of the historical narrative of urban life. Their work symbolized the fight against unseen dangers and the struggle for public health in an era when cities were often filthy, overcrowded, and teeming with pests. The rat catcher's legacy is a reminder of how far society has come in understanding and managing the diseases that plagued urban centers, and the tireless, sometimes thankless, work of those who helped to protect the public from these invisible threats.
In the courts of royal families during the 16th and 17th centuries, a peculiar and often misunderstood figure existed: the whipping boy. This individual, typically a young boy, was chosen to serve a very specific and rather grim purpose: to be punished in place of a prince or royal heir whenever the royal child misbehaved or failed to meet certain standards of conduct. The role of the whipping boy, though based in the royal need for discipline,
was rooted in the complex and often harsh world of noble upbringing. The idea of the whipping boy stemmed from the belief that princes and heirs were to be treated with the utmost care and protection. It was considered inappropriate and even unthinkable for the royal family to physically punish their children. After all, these young royals were future kings, queens, or rulers, and it was believed that any physical punishment could tarnish their image, status, or future potential. The emotional and psychological well-being of the prince or princess was a priority, and so, instead of the child being punished directly, another child, a whipping boy, was assigned to bear the punishment on their behalf. The whipping boy was typically a young boy of similar age to the prince, often from a noble or even a common background, depending on the circumstances. He would be raised alongside the prince, receiving the same education and privileges. The relationship between the prince and the whipping boy was one of proximity, but also a deep imbalance of power. The whipping boy was expected to learn the same lessons, but also to endure punishment for the mistakes or transgressions committed by the royal child. Punishments could vary depending on the nature of the prince's misdeeds. If the prince misbehaved, failed to learn his lessons, or made mistakes in his behavior, the whipping boy would be summoned to the royal chambers or courtyard, where he would be whipped or beaten by a tutor or royal servant. The idea behind this was simple. It was hoped that the prince would learn from the pain his companion endured, understanding that his actions had consequences, even if those consequences were never directly imposed on him. This peculiar practice was not without its flaws. It placed the whipping boy in a deeply subservient and often painful position. While he lived among the luxury and privilege of the royal court, his life was marked by constant fear of punishment, which he had no way to avoid. The constant threat of physical punishment for something beyond his control would have been emotionally and physically taxing, and many historical accounts suggest that the relationship between the whipping boy and the prince could be complex, with resentment, confusion, and a sense of injustice looming in the background. Though the practice may seem cruel by modern standards, it was based on the philosophy that a prince, in order to rule effectively, needed to be shielded from the direct experience of discipline. The idea was that physical punishment could damage the prince's future reputation and authority. However, it also underscored the vast gap between the royal and common classes, as the whipping boy was often a servant in all but name, fulfilling a role that was both degrading and dangerous. Interestingly, while the practice of the whipping boy was most common in European royal courts, especially in England, it was not always a permanent position. Often the position was filled for a short period during childhood, after which the whipping boy would either return to his family or transition to another role. Some whipping boys were treated well, while others faced extreme hardships. In some rare cases, these boys were able to rise in status within the court, but this was the exception rather than the rule. The practice of using a whipping boy began to fade in the 17th century as social attitudes toward punishment and education evolved. As the Enlightenment brought new ideas about child-rearing, discipline, and the nature of royalty, the idea of punishing an innocent child for the mistakes of a prince seemed increasingly barbaric. By the 18th century, the role of the whipping boy had largely disappeared, replaced by new methods of royal education and discipline that did not involve physical punishment. In modern times, the concept of the whipping boy has taken on symbolic meaning. It is often used metaphorically to describe someone who is punished or held responsible for something they did not directly cause, much like the scapegoat. In a broader sense, the historical figure of the whipping boy represents the often cruel practices of old systems of education, royalty, and class structure, where power was wielded without empathy for those who served beneath it. Though largely relegated to the annals of history, the story of the whipping boy serves as a chilling reminder of the ways in which power, privilege, and punishment were intertwined in the royal courts of the past. It also highlights the injustices faced by those who serve the privileged, enduring hardship for the sake of another's well-being and status. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, the art of copying texts by hand was a crucial and labor-intensive task. The scribe was the individual entrusted with this responsibility, and their work was indispensable to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. These men and women, often working in monasteries, royal courts, or universities, would dedicate their lives to transcribing manuscripts, sometimes spending years carefully copying every word of a text by hand. The role of the scribe was both a revered and exhausting one. Before the printing press revolutionized the way books were produced, every book had to be painstakingly copied by hand. This meant that a single manuscript could take months or even years to complete, depending on its length. The scribe's job was not simply to write. It was to reproduce the text with precision and consistency. They needed to ensure that every letter, word, and sentence matched the original text exactly, as any mistake could alter the meaning or interpretation of the work. For this reason, scribes were often highly skilled individuals, sometimes trained in specific script styles or languages, such as Latin, Greek, or Hebrew. Scribes worked primarily in locations where books were highly valued, such as monasteries, where the preservation of religious texts was paramount, or in royal courts, where knowledge and learning were highly prized. In these settings, scribes would copy everything from religious scriptures like the Bible to scientific treatises, legal documents, and literary works. The scribe's task was of immense importance, as these handwritten books were often the only copies of a work in existence. The process of writing was labor-intensive. Scribes typically used quills made from bird feathers or reeds to write on parchment or vellum, a material made from the skin of animals. This required great skill and care, as the scribe had to maintain a steady hand to produce legible, consistent text. The ink, which was usually made from soot, gallnuts, and other natural materials, would often run dry, requiring the scribe to constantly replenish their supply. The act of copying text was not simply about putting pen to paper. It was a meticulous and repetitive task that demanded patience and attention to detail. In addition to the physical labor, scribes were also responsible for organizing and formatting the text. This might include adding headings, footnotes, or illustrations to make the text easier to read or to add visual appeal. In some cases, scribes were responsible for creating beautiful illuminated manuscripts, which were books adorned with intricate designs, gold leaf, and vibrant colors. These works of art were often reserved for religious texts or important works, making them highly valuable and prized possessions. The work of a scribe was not limited to copying texts that already existed. Scribes were also involved in the creation of new works. They often served as secretaries or clerks, transcribing letters, legal documents, and government records. In some cases, scribes were commissioned to write books that reflected the ideas or philosophies of the time, preserving important cultural knowledge for future generations. They were, in essence, the conduits through which knowledge was passed down from one generation to the next. However, the life of a scribe was not without its hardships. The work was grueling and could be isolating. Scribes often worked in dimly lit rooms, hunched over their desks for hours on end copying text. It was a task that required intense concentration, and even the smallest mistake could result in the need to start over. As many scribes were monks or religious men, their daily lives often involved long hours of work, prayer, and contemplation. This routine, though fulfilling for some, could be exhausting, and the scribe's work often went unnoticed by the wider public. The arrival of the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s, marked the beginning of the end for the profession of the scribe. With the ability to print books quickly and cheaply, the demand for handwritten manuscripts decreased dramatically. What had once been an essential part of knowledge transmission was now a time-consuming and expensive luxury. The printed book, with its mass production capabilities, made knowledge more accessible to the wider public and helped spread ideas across Europe during the Renaissance and beyond. Despite the decline of their role, scribes left a lasting legacy. Their painstaking work helped preserve the works of ancient civilizations, religious texts, and important historical documents that may otherwise have been lost. They were the custodians of knowledge in an age before the printing press, and without their efforts, much of the world's intellectual heritage would have been left unread and forgotten. In the modern day, the work of the scribe is often romanticized. The image of the diligent monk hunched over a manuscript, meticulously copying texts by candlelight, evokes a sense of reverence for the past. Today, scribes are not in demand as they once were, but their contributions to the preservation of history and knowledge continue to be celebrated. Whether through their involvement in the creation of illuminated manuscripts or their role in safeguarding religious and philosophical texts, scribes were indispensable to the transmission of ideas and the cultivation of learning during the medieval and early modern periods. In the gritty, industrialized cities of the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in places like London, the mudlark was an individual who searched the riverbanks, especially along the muddy shores of the Thames, for valuable or useful items that had been discarded or washed ashore. These scavengers, often children or the poor, were the human embodiment of survival in an era marked by poverty, overcrowding, and the rapid expansion of cities. The role of a mudlark was one of necessity rather than choice, as they scoured the riverside mud for anything that could be sold, repurposed, or used to better their difficult lives. Mudlarks worked along the banks of the Thames River, which during the Industrial Revolution was a bustling center of trade, commerce, and manufacturing. Ships carrying goods from all over the world regularly docked at the river, leaving behind scraps and remnants of their cargo. Over time, the riverbanks became a dumping ground for the refuse of both the wealthy and the working class, with everything from broken tools, discarded clothing, to bits of metal, glass, and wood, ending up in the mud. The mudlark's work was a physically demanding and often dangerous job. They would wade into the thick, slippery mud along the riverbanks, sifting through the muck and filth to find anything that might be of value. This included anything from small metal objects, coins, and jewelry, to pottery shards, glass bottles, and scrap metal. The items they found could often be sold to collectors, recycled for their material value, or used in other ways, making this scavenging a vital means of survival for many in the poor and working-class communities of London. Life as a mudlark was perilous. The Thames was notoriously polluted, especially during the Victorian era, when industrial waste, human refuse, and sewage regularly flowed into the river. The filth in the water and mud posed significant health risks, and mudlarks often faced exposure to dangerous diseases. Additionally, the water levels in the Thames could fluctuate drastically, leading to swift tides that could catch mudlarks off guard and even lead to drowning. Furthermore, the industrial activity along the river often meant that mudlarks had to work alongside dangerous machinery, thick smoke, and the constant hustle of ships and traders. Despite these challenges, mudlarks played an important role in the ecosystem of a growing industrial city. They helped to clean the river by retrieving waste, and their scavenging provided a resourceful way to repurpose objects that would otherwise have gone to waste. Some of the objects they found were of significant historical or cultural value. including pieces of pottery from ancient civilizations, medieval artifacts, and rare objects from different periods of history. Over time, many of these items made their way into museums or private collections, shedding light on the rich history of the city and the artifacts that had been lost over centuries. Mudlarking was not just limited to children and the destitute. Some adults also engaged in the activity, driven by the possibility of finding valuable treasures. However, the practice of mudlarking was often viewed with disdain by the upper classes, who considered it a lowly and unsavory activity. Still, for many working-class families, it was a means of survival. The opportunity to find a discarded coin or a valuable piece of scrap metal could make a significant difference in a family's fortunes. As the Industrial Revolution continued to shape London, the popularity of mudlarking grew, with more people flooding to the riverbanks in search of treasure. By the early 20th century, the practice became somewhat romanticized, as many found the idea of discovering hidden relics in the murky depths of the Thames intriguing. The river, once a source of waste and pollution, became a treasure chest for those willing to brave its dangerous banks. Today, mudlarking is still a hobby for some individuals, though it has evolved from a necessity into an organized activity. Modern mudlarks use specialized tools to search for historical artifacts, and their finds can sometimes be of great historical importance. In recent years, the Thames has yielded ancient coins, Roman artifacts, and even lost items from famous figures in history. Modern mudlarks must also follow strict regulations, as laws govern the recovery of artifacts from public spaces. The items they discover often provide valuable insights into London's past, shedding light on everything from the Roman occupation of Britain to the lives of ordinary people living during the Victorian era. The image of the mudlark, though often associated with poverty and hardship, symbolizes the resourcefulness of the human spirit. In the murky waters of the Thames, these individuals made a living by turning discarded objects into valuable finds, and in doing so, they preserved pieces of history that might otherwise have been lost to time. Today, the legacy of the mudlark continues, reminding us that even in the most challenging circumstances, there is potential for discovery, resilience, and occasionally treasure. In the early 19th century, particularly in Britain, there existed a dark and disturbing profession that was essential to the advancement of medical science at the time: the resurrectionist. These individuals, often seen as criminals and outcasts, were hired to dig up freshly buried bodies from graveyards, often at night, and sell them to medical schools for dissection and study. Though highly illegal and regarded with great moral disdain, the role of the resurrectionist was a direct result of the burgeoning field of anatomy and the desperate need for cadavers to further medical knowledge. During this period, medical schools and universities were beginning to recognize the importance of dissection for understanding human anatomy. However, there was a severe shortage of legally available bodies for this purpose. In the early 1800s, the only way for medical students to study human anatomy was through dissection. But the law only allowed the bodies of executed criminals to be used for this purpose. As the demand for cadavers grew, so did the illegal trade in human remains, with resurrectionists providing the bodies needed for education and research. The work of a resurrectionist was dangerous, both from a legal and physical standpoint. Grave robbing was a serious crime, and those caught could face severe punishment, including hanging. Yet, the resurrectionists worked in the shadows, often operating in the dead of night, with the goal of obtaining the freshly buried bodies that had not yet been disturbed by the natural decay process. They would typically target graves of recently deceased individuals, as the bodies were fresher and easier to sell to medical schools. In many cases, resurrectionists used basic tools such as shovels and crowbars to break into graves, working quickly to avoid detection. The process of body snatching was not without risks, however. Graveyards were often watched by night watchmen, caretakers, or relatives of the deceased, who were aware of the illegal activity taking place. As a result, resurrectionists were often forced to be stealthy, using disguises or operating in the cover of darkness. In some cases, they would have inside connections with medical professionals or academics, who would provide them with tips on where to find the freshest bodies and where to deliver their grisly cargo. Once a body had been exhumed, it was typically sold to medical schools, where it would be used for dissection in anatomy classes. Medical students at the time were expected to learn human anatomy through hands-on experience, and a cadaver was an essential tool for their education. The dissection of human bodies provided invaluable insights into the structure and function of the human body, and it played a crucial role in advancing medical knowledge, particularly in fields such as surgery and pathology. However, the practice of body snatching did not go unchallenged. As medical schools grew in number and demand for cadavers continued to rise, so too did the public outcry over the morality of grave robbing. In response to the growing concern, some medical schools began to establish formal relationships with resurrectionists, turning a blind eye to the illicit nature of their work in exchange for a steady supply of bodies. But for the most part, the resurrectionists operated on the fringes of society, constantly evading the law and living in fear of being caught.
In some cases, resurrectionists became so bold that they were able to exhume multiple bodies in a single night, often selling them to different institutions or even using them to create a black market for human remains. The practice was particularly widespread in large cities like London, where medical schools were desperate for bodies, and the number of unclaimed corpses was relatively high. As a result, resurrectionists became infamous figures in these urban centers, and their actions were the subject of much public scandal. The practice of body snatching finally began to decline in the mid-19th century, as reforms in both the medical profession and the law made it less necessary. The passing of the Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain marked a significant turning point. This law allowed medical schools to obtain bodies from the poor, who had died in workhouses, or from those who had no family to claim their remains. While the law still restricted the use of executed criminals' bodies for dissection, it provided a legal means for obtaining cadavers for medical research, thereby reducing the need for resurrectionists and their illegal activities. Though the law helped curb the practice, it did not entirely eliminate the demand for bodies, and the trade in human remains continued for some time. However, by the latter half of the 19th century, advances in medical science and the growth of ethical standards in the field of anatomy largely replaced the need for resurrectionists. The demand for bodies became more regulated, and medical schools began to rely on lawful means of acquiring cadavers for educational purposes. The legacy of the resurrectionist is one of grim necessity in the history of medicine. While their actions were illegal and deeply unsettling, they played a crucial role in the development of modern medical education. Without their clandestine work, the study of human anatomy and the understanding of the human body might have been stunted, delaying many of the medical advancements that we take for granted today. Though no longer a part of medical history, the resurrectionist serves as a reminder of the sometimes dark and morally ambiguous paths that have led to the progress and knowledge we now possess in the field of medicine. In many ancient and pre-modern societies, access to clean, fresh water was not as simple as turning on a faucet. The water carrier was a crucial figure in the daily life of cities and villages around the world.
This profession involved manually transporting water from natural sources such as rivers, wells, or springs, and delivering it to homes, businesses, and public places. The role of the water carrier was essential for maintaining sanitation, cooking, and other daily activities, particularly in urban centers where plumbing systems had not yet been developed. In ancient civilizations, such as those in Egypt, Greece, and Rome, as well as in medieval cities, water carriers were often among the most visible and labor-intensive workers in society. The water they delivered was used for drinking, cooking, bathing, and irrigation, making it one of the most valuable commodities of the time. Without it, life in these societies would have been impossible, which is why the work of water carriers was so vital. The work of a water carrier was physically demanding and often dangerous. The carriers would typically use large, heavy vessels or containers, often made of clay, metal, or leather, to collect water from the local river, well, or spring. These containers could range from small jugs to large barrels, depending on the amount of water needed. The water was then carried back, often over long distances, to homes or public baths, where it was distributed. In some areas, water carriers also had to climb steep hills, navigate through crowded streets, or cross difficult terrain to deliver their water. The tools and techniques of water carrying varied depending on the region and time period. In ancient Rome, for instance, water carriers, known as aquarii, would fill their large ceramic amphorae from the city's elaborate aqueducts. However, these systems only provided water to public fountains and baths, and private homes still relied on water carriers to supply their needs. In other parts of the world, such as in Africa and parts of Asia, water carriers used wooden yokes or baskets to balance large jugs of water on their shoulders, a technique still used in some rural areas today. The process of water carrying was not only physically taxing but also time-consuming. In cities without an advanced plumbing system, such as medieval Europe or parts of the Middle East, water carriers would make several trips a day, hauling water to fulfill the needs of their communities. Often they would work from dawn until dusk, sometimes carrying heavy loads in extreme heat or cold. Water carriers were often paid for their service by the amount of water they delivered, and in some cases, they had to make sure they provided enough water for a particular neighborhood or wealthy household. Water carriers also played an important role in maintaining public health. In places where water sources were not reliably clean, they had to be cautious in their collection methods. In some cultures, water carriers were even responsible for purifying water before it was delivered, whether by filtering it through cloth or ensuring that it was not contaminated with dirt or waste. However, because many of these workers were not formally trained in sanitation, there were often risks associated with drinking water delivered by the water carriers, especially in larger urban areas where pollution was an issue. Despite the importance of their role, water carriers were often among the lower classes of society. The work was hard and underappreciated, and many water carriers faced difficult living conditions. They were frequently paid poorly for their labor, and their work was physically exhausting. In many societies, water carriers were often seen as menial workers, with their jobs considered less prestigious than those of skilled tradespeople or artisans. In addition to their role as water carriers, many of these workers developed a sense of community and solidarity with each other. In some cultures, water carriers would form cooperatives or guilds to collectively bargain for better wages, working conditions, or access to water sources. These groups could also offer some degree of protection from the authorities, as they often worked in areas with strict regulations about who could access water and where it could be carried. As time passed and technology advanced, the role of the water carrier began to diminish. The development of aqueducts, wells with mechanical pumps, and eventually modern plumbing systems meant that water could be delivered more efficiently and on a larger scale. Cities built with modern infrastructure no longer needed individuals to manually transport water, and the profession of water carrier slowly disappeared in most urban settings. However, in rural or less developed areas of the world, the role of the water carrier still exists today. In some places, particularly in regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, people still rely on manual methods to fetch and transport water from distant sources. In these areas, water carriers often face the same physical challenges as their ancestors, but they also play a key role in providing vital resources to communities that lack modern water infrastructure. The legacy of the water carrier is one of hard work, perseverance, and community service. In a world where water is essential for life, the role of those who carried it, often unnoticed, was fundamental to the survival and functioning of society. Though technology has reduced the need for human labor in this regard, the memory of the water carrier still resonates, reminding us of the lengths to which people once went to ensure that their communities had the precious liquid that sustains life. Before the widespread use of electricity and the advent of street lights powered by modern energy sources, the role of the lamp lighter was a vital part of daily life in cities and towns around the world. These individuals were responsible for lighting and extinguishing street lamps at specific times of the day, ensuring that city streets remained illuminated after dusk, and providing a sense of safety and security to those navigating the night. The job of a lamplighter typically began at sunset, long before the advent of electric lighting. In the 18th and 19th centuries, gas lamps were the primary source of public illumination, particularly in growing cities like London, Paris, and New York. These lamps, fueled by gas, needed to be lit manually by the lamplighter, who would walk along the streets with a long pole or ladder to ignite the flames that illuminated the city. The lamps themselves were often large and somewhat cumbersome structures with a glass casing that contained the burning gas. Lamplighters would carry a torch or a match on a long pole, which they would use to ignite the gas flame in each individual lamp. They were required to light each lamp one by one, a task that could take several hours in larger cities with long streets lined with many lamps. The lamps often needed to be carefully adjusted to ensure that they burned properly, with enough light to make the streets visible, but not so much that it created dangerous glare or waste. As night fell, lamplighters would typically work alone or in small teams, covering specific sections of the city. The timing of their work was critical, as they had to light the lamps precisely at the right moment to ensure that streets remained illuminated during the hours of darkness. This task required a deep knowledge of the city's layout, as well as an awareness of the specific times when the lamps needed to be lit or extinguished, depending on the season. In addition to lighting the lamps, lamplighters were also responsible for maintaining them. This included cleaning the lamps, trimming the wicks to ensure that the flames burned evenly, and refilling the gas or oil supply. The maintenance of the lamps was a regular task, as poorly maintained lamps would either burn too dimly or fail to ignite altogether, leaving parts of the city in darkness. The role of the lamplighter was not just a technical one. It also played a part in shaping the atmosphere of the city. In many places, the nightly ritual of lighting the lamps became a well-known and almost romanticized part of urban life. The image of the lamplighter, often silhouetted against the evening sky as they went about their work, added to the charm and mystery of the nighttime cityscape. In some cultures, the task of lighting the lamps was seen as a form of performance or even poetry, as the ritual illuminated not just the streets but the soul of the city itself. As cities grew and populations expanded, the need for public lighting became even more pressing. In the 19th century, as gas lighting spread across Europe and North America, lamp lighters were employed in virtually every major city. It was a job that provided steady work for many people, often requiring little formal education or training, but demanding physical labor, as lamplighters had to traverse long distances each night, carrying the equipment necessary to perform their tasks.
The lamplighter's job was often dangerous as well. The lamps were located on tall poles, and the lamplighters were required to climb ladders or use long poles to reach the flames. Accidents could occur, particularly in windy or wet conditions, when the risk of falling or burning oneself was higher. Additionally, the presence of gas made the task even riskier, as faulty equipment or poorly ventilated lamps could lead to explosions or fire hazards. However, despite these dangers, many lamplighters carried out their work with dedication, knowing that their efforts helped ensure the safety and functionality of the city after dark. The profession of the lamplighter began to fade in the early 20th century as electric lighting became more common. The introduction of electric street lights made the work of manually lighting gas lamps obsolete, as electricity provided a safer, more reliable, and cost-effective alternative. In many cities, electric lights began to replace gas lamps, and by the 1920s, the need for lamplighters had greatly diminished. Those who had worked as lamplighters were gradually displaced by advances in technology and the development of modern urban infrastructure. Despite the decline of the profession, the image of the lamplighter remains a nostalgic symbol of a bygone era. In literature, film, and art, the figure of the lamplighter is often used to evoke a sense of history, romanticism, and the transition from a more labor-intensive, handcrafted world to the modern, mechanized one we live in today. In some cities, the tradition of lighting street lamps has been preserved in ceremonial or tourist contexts, offering a glimpse into the past. Today, the lamplighter is a historical curiosity, but their legacy lives on in the stories and images of a time when the flickering light of a gas lamp marked the boundaries between night and day. The work they did, though it has largely been replaced by modern technologies, played an essential role in shaping urban life, and their contribution to the development of public lighting remains a key chapter in the story of how cities became safer and more accessible after dark.
In the courts of kings and emperors, where lavish banquets were a regular occurrence and food was an important symbol of power and prestige, there existed a highly specialized and sometimes dangerous role, the food taster. These individuals were employed to ensure that the meals prepared for royalty and high-ranking officials were free from poison, a real and constant threat in medieval and early modern times. Their job was to sample the food before the monarch or dignitary ate, serving as a safeguard against assassination by poisoning. The role of the food taster was deeply intertwined with the politics of the time. In a world where intrigue, betrayal, and assassination were common, food poisoning was a relatively easy way to eliminate an enemy or rival. Royal families, rulers, and high officials were constantly in danger of being poisoned by enemies, disgruntled courtiers, or even ambitious members of their own family. As a result, food tasters became an integral part of the royal household, trusted with the responsibility of preventing such an assassination. The food taster's role was a simple one in theory. They would eat a portion of the food or drink prepared for the king or queen, often in front of them, and wait to see if it was safe. The belief was that if the food had been poisoned, the taster would show immediate signs of illness, such as nausea, vomiting, or convulsions, thus giving the ruler time to take precautions before eating the same meal. In some cases, food tasters were even tasked with drinking wine or taking bites of pastries before the monarch did. ensuring that any potential danger was caught before the king or queen consumed the dish. The food taster was typically someone who held a relatively low position in the royal hierarchy. Often these individuals were servants, slaves, or individuals who were somewhat expendable, as their lives were considered less valuable than that of the ruler. In some cases, food tasters were trained to recognize the symptoms of poisoning, and they might have a knowledge of the various poisons used at the time. However, it was often a matter of luck and quick reaction, as many poisons were tasteless, colorless, and could be difficult to detect. As such, food tasters lived under the constant threat of death, with no certainty that they would escape the lethal effects of a particularly potent poison. Food tasters were not only used in royal courts, but were also found in wealthy households or among the elite, where the threat of poisoning was seen as a real concern. In some cultures, particularly in ancient Rome, there were even specialized roles for tasters who would test not just food, but also beverages, including wine, which was often seen as a medium for poisoning. While food tasters may have been a necessary part of court life, their position was a precarious one. The nature of the job meant that they were often viewed with suspicion, as their survival was a direct reflection of the safety of the ruling class. If a food taster died from poisoning, it was often seen as a failure of the royal household's security, and questions would arise about whether the monarch had been targeted. On the other hand, if the taster survived, they were often praised for their service and their ability to detect the poison in time. In some cases, food tasters were given small rewards or protections, but their work remained dangerous and unpredictable. Over time, as advances in medicine, forensics, and food safety improved, the role of the food taster slowly disappeared. By the 18th century, when more sophisticated methods of detecting poison became available, and when rulers began to employ bodyguards and security personnel to protect them from assassination, the food taster was no longer seen as a necessary part of court life. However, the legacy of food tasting remains embedded in history, particularly as a symbol of the treacherous nature of court politics and the lengths to which people went to secure power. While the position of food taster may seem unusual by modern standards, it highlights an important aspect of life in royal courts and ancient societies, where trust was scarce and betrayal was a constant threat. The job was a blend of servitude and sacrifice, as the taster risked their own life for the sake of the ruler's safety, often with little recognition or reward. For the monarch, the food taster's work represented an invisible line of defense against the ever-present danger of poison. And for the food taster, it was a job that carried with it both the potential for glory and the very real risk of a sudden and untimely death.
The castrato singer is a figure from music history whose unique and often tragic role shaped the sound of opera during the Baroque and classical periods. These performers were male singers who, as children, underwent a gruesome and irreversible procedure of castration before puberty in order to preserve their high, angelic voices. This practice, which was most prominent in Italy from the 16th to the 18th centuries, was seen as a way to create a powerful, unique sound that was in high demand in both religious and theatrical music at the time. The idea behind castration for musical purposes was based on the belief that castrating a boy before puberty would prevent his larynx from maturing fully. This would stop the deepening of his voice, leaving him with a high, soprano-like vocal range that was not possible for regular men. The resulting sound was often described as powerful, pure, and ethereal, a voice that could carry over orchestras and fill the grandest of opera houses. Castrati were highly valued in the world of opera, both as vocalists and as icons. They became the superstars of the 17th and 18th centuries, performing in front of adoring crowds, many of whom were fascinated by the spectacle of a man with the vocal ability of a woman.
These singers were particularly sought after for the demanding roles in opera seria, the grand operatic form that dominated the period. Composers such as Handel and Mozart wrote parts specifically for the castrato voice, creating intricate, high-flying melodies that could only be executed by those who underwent this painful procedure. The practice of creating castrati began in Italy and was initially tied to religious music. In the Catholic Church, women were forbidden to sing in choirs, so young boys were often trained to sing in the higher vocal ranges. The idea of maintaining the angelic, ethereal voice of a child well into adulthood eventually evolved into the practice of castration. While the procedure was done with the intent of preserving the child's vocal range, it also allowed the church to have adult male voices in choirs, without the deeper voice that would come with puberty. For the boys who underwent this procedure, life was often marked by tragedy. The surgery, which was performed without anesthesia and was excruciatingly painful, usually took place when the child was between the ages of 7 and 12. The operation was dangerous and could lead to infection or death, though many survived. Those who did live through it were then subjected to intense musical training, which could span many years, as they were groomed for careers as singers in both church and opera settings. Castrati were celebrated and feted in society, and many rose to great fame, especially in the courts of Europe. They were treated almost like celebrities, admired for their vocal talent, and often indulged with great luxury and riches. Some of the most famous castrati, such as Farinelli, Senesino, and Caffarelli, became household names, performing in the grandest opera houses and earning large sums for their performances. Their status as performers was unparalleled, and their vocal abilities were considered so extraordinary that they became the stars of opera during their time. However, the lives of castrati were often fraught with difficulties beyond their physical mutilation. They were in many ways seen as anomalies, caught between the realms of masculinity and femininity. While their high voices made them seem feminine, their bodies were still male, which led to a complex and often challenging identity. Many castrati were also expected to have romantic relationships, which they often did, despite their inability to physically reproduce. In some cases, castrati would enter into marriages or relationships, sometimes to gain social status, though they were unable to have children. The appeal of the castrato gradually began to fade toward the late 18th century. As opera evolved and vocal techniques improved, composers began to turn away from writing specifically for castrati, preferring the richer, more versatile voices of the natural soprano, mezzo-soprano, and tenor singers. The rise of the soprano voice, particularly in opera, further marginalized the castrato's role in performance. By the 19th century, the practice of creating castrati had largely disappeared, partly due to changes in medical ethics and growing awareness of the horrific consequences of the procedure. The last known castrato, Alessandro Moreschi, performed into the early 20th century, and recordings of his voice still exist today. Moreschi's voice, while certainly remarkable, is a haunting reminder of the pain and sacrifice that define the lives of castrati throughout history. While the practice of creating castrati is now considered barbaric and inhumane, it stands as a testament to the lengths people were willing to go in the pursuit of artistic perfection. The castrato voice, though now lost to history, played a significant role in shaping the development of opera and vocal music, and the individuals who underwent this painful and life-altering process remain among the most fascinating, tragic figures in the history of music. The stonebreaker was a laborer whose role, though physically demanding and often grueling, was crucial in the construction and development of infrastructure before the advent of modern machinery. These workers were employed to break large stones into smaller, more manageable pieces, which could then be used for various construction projects such as roads, buildings, and foundations. This job, which required both strength and endurance, was often considered a low-status occupation, but it played a fundamental role in the development of cities and transportation networks. Historically, stone breaking was a key part of road building, particularly in the pre-industrial world. Before the invention of asphalt and concrete, roads were often made of compacted earth, gravel, or cobblestones. The stone breaker's job was to create the necessary materials for these roads by manually smashing large rocks into smaller fragments. The stones were often shaped into even pieces that could be laid down on roads or in construction projects, helping to create surfaces that were smoother and more durable than simple earth tracks. In many cases, stone breakers worked on road construction projects, where their work was essential for building the pathways that connected cities, towns, and villages. These roads were vital for trade, travel, and communication, making the stone breakers an important, if uncelebrated, part of society's infrastructure. However, it was backbreaking work, requiring long hours in difficult conditions. Stone breakers would often work outdoors in harsh weather conditions, using simple tools like hammers, chisels, and pickaxes to break the rocks into smaller pieces. The work was physically taxing because the stones being broken were often enormous, and the process of reducing them to smaller fragments was both time-consuming and dangerous. The workers would need to exert considerable force, using a hammer to crack the stones, which sometimes led to injury due to the constant repetition of heavy labor and the risks associated with the tools used. The tools themselves were primitive, consisting of large iron hammers, picks, and chisels, which, while effective, were not ergonomic or designed to minimize strain on the body. Long periods of stone breaking could lead to conditions such as muscle strain, joint pain, and other physical ailments, making it a job that wore down the body over time. Aside from road construction, stone breakers were also employed in other building projects, particularly in the creation of large stone structures like bridges, aqueducts, and buildings. In some parts of the world, stone breaking was a crucial part of quarrying operations, where workers would extract stones from the earth and then break them into smaller, usable pieces. These smaller stones could then be used for building purposes or transported to different sites for use in construction. The lives of stone breakers were often harsh and marked by poverty. They were typically working-class individuals, and the job offered little in terms of status or recognition. Many stone breakers were also employed as day laborers, which meant that they were paid for the work they completed each day, rather than earning a steady wage or salary. This made it difficult for them to support their families and plan for the future. In some societies, stone breakers were considered among the lowest in the labor hierarchy, seen as little more than manual laborers who performed menial and physically exhausting tasks. Despite the physical demands and low social status, the work of the stone breaker was indispensable to the development of urban and rural infrastructure. Roads and buildings made from stone were far more durable than those made from wood or other materials, and their longevity played a key role in the growth of civilizations. In the absence of modern machinery such as bulldozers, crushers, and mechanical hammers, the stone breaker was an essential worker who contributed directly to the material progress of their society. The stone breaker's role began to diminish with the onset of industrialization and the development of mechanized tools. As machines were invented to crush and shape stone more efficiently, the need for manual laborers in this role decreased. In the 19th century, the advent of steam-powered engines, followed by the internal combustion engine and, eventually, modern construction equipment, revolutionized the way roads were built and stones were processed. Machines like stone crushers and road graders made the manual labor of the stone breaker obsolete, and the profession gradually disappeared from the modern workforce. Though the job of the stone breaker is now largely a thing of the past, it is a symbol of the grueling, labor-intensive work that went into the construction of the infrastructure that we take for granted today. From the roads we drive onto the buildings we live and work in, the efforts of stone breakers helped lay the foundation for the cities, towns, and civilizations that emerged over the centuries. Their contributions, though often overlooked, were crucial in the evolution of human societies, demonstrating the importance of manual labor in shaping the physical world around us. The scold's bridal enforcer was a role that existed in a time when social norms, particularly regarding the behavior of women, were strictly enforced, and any deviation from these norms was seen as a threat to the order of society. This job was tied to the infamous device known as the scold's bridle, a form of punishment used primarily in early modern Europe, particularly in England and parts of Scotland. The scold's bridle was a metal contraption designed to silence and humiliate women who were deemed to be too outspoken, rebellious, or talkative, labeled as scolds by their communities. The role of the scold's bridle enforcer was to oversee the punishment and ensure that women who were caught speaking out of turn or engaging in behavior considered inappropriate were publicly humiliated. The enforcer was responsible for placing the iron bridle on the woman's head, which was essentially a metal cage that covered the woman's face. This cage had a bridle that went over the woman's head, and sometimes it would have a sharp metal device that inserted into the woman's mouth, preventing her from speaking. The purpose of the device was not only to silence the woman, but to also punish her for speaking too much or too loudly, which was seen as a violation of societal expectations for women at the time. The scold's bridle itself was a cruel and uncomfortable device. The bridle was typically made of iron, and the woman was often paraded through the streets while wearing it as a public form of shame. The metal device was designed to restrict her movements and prevent her from speaking, and sometimes the muzzle would cause physical pain, with sharp protrusions digging into the tongue if she tried to speak. The punishment was not just about silencing the woman, but about degrading her in front of her community, reinforcing the idea that women should not be too vocal or too independent. Scolding, as it was defined by society, included behaviors such as gossiping, arguing in public, or generally challenging the authority of men. Women who were considered scolds were often seen as troublemakers, and the punishment was meant to serve as both a deterrent to the individual woman and a warning to others. These women were typically accused of disrupting the peace, undermining the social hierarchy, or questioning traditional gender roles. The enforcer's job often went hand in hand with the power structures of the time. It was not uncommon for the enforcer to be a local official or a town crier, a figure who had the authority to carry out punishments and publicly humiliate those who had broken the societal rules. The role of the enforcer was not just to place the bridle on the woman, but also to oversee her punishment, ensuring that she was subjected to the full extent of public humiliation. This could involve forcing her to stand in the marketplace or on a scaffold while the community looked on, making the woman a spectacle of shame. The enforcer's role, therefore, was more about reinforcing social norms and punishing women for perceived transgressions, rather than delivering any form of justice. In some cases, the punishment didn't end with the scold's bridle. Women who were branded as scolds might be subjected to additional forms of punishment, such as public flogging, imprisonment, or even banishment. The idea was that the woman's punishment would serve as a public lesson to others who might consider stepping out of line.
The scold's bridle was not just a tool of punishment, but also a symbol of the deep-seated misogyny that existed in many societies at the time. It reflected a broader social mindset in which women were expected to remain silent, obedient, and subservient, particularly to men. Speaking out or challenging the status quo was seen as a serious breach of conduct, one that needed to be met with shame and public degradation. The bridle, in its various forms, acted as a constant reminder of the consequences of defying traditional gender roles. By the 18th century, the use of the scold's bridle began to decline. As ideas about individual rights and gender equality began to shift, particularly during the Enlightenment and the early feminist movements, the practice was seen as cruel and outdated. The rising influence of human rights and social reform led to the eventual abolition of such devices, but not before they had left a deep mark on the cultural and social landscape of early modern Europe. The role of the scold's bridle enforcer is now a dark and uncomfortable chapter in history, a reminder of the ways in which women were historically controlled and punished for behaviors that were deemed inappropriate or rebellious. It is also a reflection of a society where the fear of female agency and expression led to extreme measures attempting to suppress the voices and autonomy of half of the population. Today, the story of the scold's bridle serves as a stark reminder of the lengths to which society has gone to silence women and the ongoing struggle for gender equality. The Fletcher was a craftsman, skilled in the delicate and precise art of creating arrows, specifically the feathers that were attached to the shafts. In the medieval and early modern world, where archery played a critical role in warfare, hunting, and even sport, the Fletcher's work was of utmost importance. Their craftsmanship ensured that arrows flew straight and true with the proper balance, stability, and accuracy required for effective use in battle or hunting. The Fletcher's primary task was to attach feathers to the tail end of the arrow shafts, a process that was crucial for ensuring the arrow's flight. The feathers, typically goose or turkey feathers, were carefully selected and trimmed to the correct size and shape. The feathers were then glued or bound to the shaft in a specific arrangement, often using 3 feathers, each positioned at equal intervals around the shaft. This configuration was known as fletching and helped stabilize the arrow as it flew through the air, preventing it from wobbling or veering off course. In addition to attaching the feathers, the Fletcher also played a role in crafting the entire arrow. This included selecting and shaping the shaft, which was typically made of wood, though sometimes metal or other materials were used. The Fletcher had to ensure that the shaft was straight, sturdy, and properly sized to match the bow and the type of shooting for which the arrow was intended. The arrowhead, which could be made of stone, metal, or iron, was often made by a separate artisan, but the Fletcher had to ensure it was securely attached to the shaft. The Fletcher's work was an essential part of the broader industry of weapon making, particularly during periods of warfare where archery was a significant component of military tactics. Archers relied on their arrows to strike targets from a distance, and the precision and quality of the arrows could make the difference between success and failure in battle. Therefore, the Fletcher's skill was highly valued by armies, hunting parties, and anyone who relied on the bow and arrow for survival or sport. A Fletcher's workshop was a place filled with a variety of materials and tools. There were feathers to be sorted, shafts to be measured, and glue or wax to be applied. The process of creating arrows was painstaking and required a keen eye for detail. A Fletcher had to carefully select feathers with the right texture and strength, and then trim and shape them to ensure they would provide the necessary aerodynamic stability when the arrow was shot. The feathers also had to be attached in such a way that they would not easily fall off during use. Fletchers worked alongside other craftsmen, such as bowyers, who made the bows, and arrowhead makers. While these specialists focused on their individual crafts, the Fletcher's role was to ensure that the final product, the complete arrow, was functional, well-balanced, and durable. In a time when arrows were a key component of warfare and hunting, the quality of the fletching could directly impact the effectiveness of the weapon. The Fletcher's work was not limited to the military or hunting spheres. Arrows were also used in competitions where accuracy and speed were essential. In many cultures, archery contests were common pastimes. and the Fletchers' role in creating arrows for these competitions meant they contributed to both leisure activities and serious combat. 4 skilled archers having a set of high-quality, well-crafted arrows could be the difference between victory and defeat. With the advent of firearms and changes in warfare during the Renaissance and early modern periods, the demand for Fletchers began to decline. While archery was still practiced, particularly for sport and hunting, it was no longer as central to military tactics as it once was. Firearms and gunpowder weapons gradually replaced bows and arrows on the battlefield. However, Fletchers still held a niche role, especially in areas where traditional archery was maintained, and their skills were preserved for those who valued the art of the bow and arrow. In more modern times, the legacy of the Fletcher lives on in the world of archery as a sport. While today's arrows are often made using synthetic materials like carbon fiber or aluminum, the principles of fletching, careful selection of feathers, precise trimming, and attention to balance remain a part of the process for crafting high-quality arrows. There are still artisans who specialize in traditional arrow making, keeping the craft of the Fletcher alive, though their work is now more about preserving history and technique than meeting the demands of war. The Fletcher's profession, while seemingly simple, was a vital part of the material culture of the past. Their work ensured that arrows would fly with precision, helping soldiers to strike from afar and hunters to take down game. The care and craftsmanship involved in the process of fletching and the importance of their contribution to archery is often overlooked in the grand narrative of history, but it was a job that was key to the development of many societies, both in warfare and beyond. In the Middle Ages, the alewife was a woman who brewed and sold ale, a crucial beverage in societies where water was often unsafe to drink. Alewives were essential to their communities, often operating their own small brewing businesses from home or in small taverns. Ale, which was typically brewed with barley and other grains, was not just a popular drink, but an important part of daily life, consumed by people of all ages, from breakfast to bedtime. Brewing ale was a labor-intensive process, and the alewife had to master several steps, including malting the grains, boiling them with hops, fermenting the mixture, and ensuring the final product was both drinkable and enjoyable. This process required a great deal of skill, as the quality of the ale depended on the balance of ingredients and the fermentation time. Many alewives would keep their recipes secret, often passed down from generation to generation, giving their ale a unique taste that could attract a loyal following. Alewives played an important role in local economies, especially in urban areas. Since brewing was largely a domestic task, it provided women with an opportunity for economic independence, although they were often restricted by laws or social expectations. In some cases, women who brewed ale were seen as part of a long-standing tradition, while in others, their profession could be stigmatized, particularly if they were accused of selling poor-quality ale or being too independent. Despite these challenges, many alewives were successful and well-regarded within their communities. The rise of larger breweries and the industrialization of beer production eventually pushed the alewife out of the business. But the tradition of brewing at home has never completely disappeared. Today we see a resurgence in small, local craft breweries, echoing the alewives of the past, who helped shape the beer industry long before it became commercialized. The ostrich feather porter was a servant responsible for carrying and maintaining ostrich feather fans and other accessories, often used in royal courts and wealthy households. These extravagant fans, made from the long, luxurious feathers of ostriches, were symbols of status, wealth, and refinement during the 17th and 18th centuries. The feather porter's job was to ensure these delicate and highly prized objects were kept in pristine condition and ready for use during important events, ceremonies, and everyday royal activities. The role of the ostrich feather porter
emerged during a time when feathers were one of the most expensive and sought-after materials in fashion. Ostrich feathers, with their long, soft plumes, were often used in creating elaborate fans, which were wielded by ladies and even gentlemen to demonstrate their elite social standing. These fans were often adorned with precious metals, beads, or other embellishments, making them not only practical, but highly ornamental. Feather porters had to be highly meticulous in their duties. They carefully handled and transported these fans, ensuring they were not damaged or soiled. The fans were often used during royal events, from courtly dances to ceremonial functions, and had to be presented with the utmost care and elegance. In addition to transporting the fans, the porter would also be responsible for the cleaning and maintenance of the feathers, ensuring they remained in good condition despite their delicate nature. Beyond their role as caretakers of feathered accessories, ostrich feather porters often served the nobility in other capacities. They were typically part of a larger household staff, working alongside butlers, footmen, and other servants who catered to the needs of the wealthy. The porter's job, though seemingly glamorous, was still one of subservience, as they were tasked with fulfilling the desires and whims of those in positions of power. As time went on and fashion changed, the demand for ostrich feather fans began to wane, and the role of the ostrich feather porter gradually faded into obscurity. With the advent of new materials, such as synthetic fibers and other more durable alternatives, ostrich feathers lost some of their appeal. However, the history of the ostrich feather porter remains a fascinating glimpse into the world of luxury and courtly life, where every detail, from the fans to the servants, played a role in maintaining the image of wealth and prestige.
The charcoal burner was an important figure in rural economies, especially in forested regions, where their job was to produce charcoal by heating wood in a controlled, low-oxygen environment. Charcoal was a valuable resource during the pre-industrial era, serving as a key fuel source for metalworking, blacksmithing, and cooking, among other essential tasks. This craft was both physically demanding and delicate, requiring knowledge of the natural environment and an understanding of how to process wood to create charcoal. The process of making charcoal began in forests, where the charcoal burner would select trees, typically hardwoods like oak or beech, which were dense and produced high-quality charcoal. The wood would be stacked in a specific pattern in a large pit or kiln, forming a mound that was covered with earth, leaving only a small opening for ventilation. The mound would then be lit carefully, and the heat would need to be controlled over several days as the wood slowly transformed into charcoal. This process, known as charcoal burning, required patience and skill, as the burner had to maintain a constant temperature, adjusting airflow to ensure that the wood did not catch fire, but smoldered slowly instead. Charcoal burners often worked in remote, isolated areas, far from towns and villages. The process was dangerous due to the high heat involved and the risk of the fire spreading out of control. Furthermore, charcoal burning was labor-intensive, requiring long hours of monitoring the kilns and tending to the fire. Once the charcoal was ready, it would be carefully removed, often transported on foot or by cart to local markets or to the blacksmiths and metalworkers who depended on it. While charcoal burners lived in relative isolation, their work was crucial to the functioning of local economies. Charcoal was used not only in blacksmithing, but also in the production of gunpowder, as fuel for cooking, and in heating homes during the colder months. The charcoal burner was one of the many unsung laborers of pre-industrial society, whose craft was essential for the daily life and survival of communities. As industrialization progressed, the demand for charcoal decreased, replaced by more efficient and cleaner fuels such as coal and eventually natural gas. However, the legacy of the charcoal burner remains in the knowledge of the land and traditional practices that were once essential for society's growth and advancement. The court dwarf held a unique and often controversial role in royal and noble courts throughout Europe during the Renaissance and into the early modern period. Dwarfs, or little people, were often seen as curiosities or symbols of entertainment, and many were employed by royal families to serve as entertainers or companions at court. While they had a distinct and often prized place within the courts, their roles were heavily defined by their physical stature and the societal norms of the time. The primary duty of the court dwarf was to entertain the nobility, often through performances, wit, and humor. They would be called upon to perform in various capacities, such as jesters, clowns, or even mimicry artists, providing light-hearted amusement during royal gatherings, feasts, and celebrations. Their small size often made them the subject of jokes and ridicule, but at the same time their position offered them a unique status that could grant them access to royal circles, and in some cases considerable wealth and influence. In many courts, the dwarf was seen as a symbol of wealth and extravagance. Having a dwarf in attendance was a sign of the court's prestige, showcasing the ruler's generosity and ability to surround themselves with rare and fascinating individuals. Some dwarfs were treated with great respect and even held positions of relative importance. For example, some dwarfs had the ear of kings and queens, acting as confidants or advisors in certain situations. While their status was always lower than that of the nobility, they sometimes occupied spaces in the royal court that were beyond what one might expect from someone in their position. In addition to entertainment, dwarfs were often used in other ways, such as in ceremonial roles or as foolish counselors, given the historical context where jesters or court fools were expected to speak truth under the guise of humor. Their sharp wit, paired with their physical appearance, allowed them to challenge the norms of the court in a way that others could not. A dwarf's frankness, disguised as jest, sometimes enabled them to offer commentary or criticisms that were otherwise too dangerous for others to voice. However, the role of the court dwarf was not without its darker elements. Many dwarfs were subjected to exploitation, with their bodies treated as spectacles and their lives largely controlled by their royal patrons. While some were able to use their position to gain influence or wealth, others faced a life of servitude, always at the whim of their employers. The idea of the court dwarf being both entertainer and servant reflected the broader societal views of the time, where physical difference was often considered something to be used for amusement rather than valued for the individual's own worth. As the centuries passed and societal attitudes towards difference evolved, the role of the court dwarf gradually faded. With the rise of more formalized entertainment and the eventual decline of the royal court as the center of social life, dwarfs were no longer in demand as the focus of courtly entertainment. By the 18th century, the role was increasingly replaced by professional actors, comedians, and other forms of entertainment, and dwarfs were no longer seen as a necessary part of royal courts. The legacy of the court dwarf is a complex one, a mixture of both fascination and exploitation. It serves as a reminder of the ways in which physical differences were once highlighted, often for the amusement of others, and the complex intersections of power, entertainment, and identity in royal and noble circles. Despite the difficult and often degrading nature of their work, many court dwarfs were able to achieve fame, and some even left behind legacies that are remembered to this day, providing a glimpse into the peculiarities of court life during times gone by. In the medieval and early modern periods, the fuller was a crucial figure in the textile industry, playing a key role in the process of wool preparation. This often strenuous and dirty job involved fulling, which was the process of cleaning and thickening woolen cloth by removing oils, dirt, and other impurities.
The fuller used a technique that involved walking, kneeling, or standing on wool, soaked in a mixture of water and a variety of substances, one of which was urine, to cleanse and strengthen the fabric. The process of fulling was essential for transforming raw wool into the high-quality cloth that was highly sought after in markets across Europe. Fulling was a multi-step process that began with the washing of wool. The wool was first soaked in water to loosen the fibers, then it was often mixed with urine or other natural substances like soapwort. Urine, which contains ammonia, was believed to help break down the natural oils and grease present in the wool, making the fibers more pliable and ready for the next stages of processing. The fuller would then stomp or tread on the wool in large vats, using their feet to agitate the fibers, which helped to both clean the wool and thicken the fabric. This was known as fulling because the action of pressing and squeezing the wool compacted it, making it denser and more durable. Fullers, often working in teams, would typically work in fulling mills or fulling houses, which were special facilities set up for this purpose. In some areas, fulling was done in the open air, in large vats or troughs where the fullers would walk through the wool by foot. This work was physically demanding and could be very unpleasant due to the strong smells of the urine and the constant standing or kneeling in the vats. However, it was necessary work, as fulling ensured that woolen garments and cloths had the right texture and thickness for their intended use. The fuller's role was not just limited to cleaning the wool. The process also helped to ensure that the fabric was durable and waterproof. Fulling made the fibers tighter, creating a thicker cloth that could withstand more wear and tear. This made fulling essential for the production of high-quality garments, blankets, and other woolen goods. The fuller's work contributed significantly to the garment industry, which was one of the most important industries in medieval and early modern economies. Fulling mills evolved over time, with water-powered mills becoming more common, allowing for the mechanization of the process. With the rise of industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries, the role of the fuller was eventually replaced by machinery that could process wool more efficiently. However, the traditional art of fulling by foot remains a fascinating part of the history of textiles, and in some parts of the world, traditional methods are still used in artisan wool production today. The spindle spinner was a vital figure in the world of textiles, especially before the advent of industrial spinning machines. This person was responsible for spinning fibers, usually wool, flax, or cotton, into yarn or thread by hand using a simple tool called a spindle. Spinning was a repetitive and labor-intensive task, often requiring hours of focused work, and the role of the spindle spinner was fundamental to the production of fabric in pre-industrial societies. The spindle itself was a small handheld device consisting of a shaft and a weight at one end, which was used to twist and spin fibers into thread. The spinner would take raw fiber, such as wool, flax, or hemp, and draw it out into thin strands, twisting them together into thread by rotating the spindle. This was done by hand, and the spinner had to have a steady and skilled technique to create strong, uniform thread. The work was physically demanding, as it required the spinner to maintain consistent tension while drawing out the fibers and twisting them together. Spindle spinning was often done in a repetitive, meditative fashion. Many spinners would work for hours at a time, either sitting at a spinning wheel or standing while they worked with a drop spindle. This task was traditionally carried out by women, often in the home, and it was an essential part of domestic life. Spinning was one of the primary ways families created their own textiles, whether for clothing, bedding, or other goods. It was a task that required a great deal of skill, as the quality of the yarn depended on the spinner's technique and experience. In some communities, the spindle spinner was an integral part of the local economy. Some individuals or families made a living from spinning yarn and selling it to weavers who would then turn it into fabric.
Others worked within a guild system, where spinners were trained and regulated by local craft guilds. In these settings, the work of the spindle spinner was highly valued, and many spinners took great pride in the quality of the thread they produced. Spinning could also be a communal activity, with groups of women coming together to spin in social settings. This was often done in the evenings, after the day's chores were completed, and it provided an opportunity for women to socialize, exchange news, and bond with one another. The rhythmic motion of spinning and the repetition of the task made it a perfect backdrop for conversation, storytelling, and even singing. As industrialization began in the late 18th century, the role of the spindle spinner began to fade. The invention of the spinning, jenny, and other mechanized spinning devices allowed for mass production of thread and yarn, leading to the decline of hand spinning in many areas. However, spindle spinning has not disappeared completely. In some rural communities and artisan workshops, the craft is still practiced today, both as a hobby and as a method of creating high-quality yarn for traditional textiles. The legacy of the spindle spinner remains an essential part of textile history. This simple yet vital role helped to sustain families, communities, and entire industries for centuries, providing the raw materials needed to clothe the world before the rise of mechanized textile manufacturing. The skill and artistry involved in spinning remain highly respected by those who continue to practice it, and the craftsmanship of the spindle spinner is remembered as a cornerstone of pre-industrial textile production. In ancient Rome, the role of a toilet attendant was a surprisingly important yet often overlooked job within the bustling and advanced Roman public baths. These attendants worked in the public latrines, which were an essential part of Roman social life. Public baths, or thermae, were not just places to wash, but also social hubs where people would meet, relax, and engage in lively conversation. The latrines, often attached to these bathhouses, were communal spaces, and here the toilet attendants performed their often unsung duties. Roman public toilets were very different from modern-day facilities. They consisted of long benches with holes, arranged in a row and no privacy whatsoever. People would sit side by side, engaging in conversation or simply getting on with the business of the day. Toilet attendants had to ensure that the communal latrines were kept clean and functional. Their primary job was to assist bathers by providing them with sponge sticks. Sponges attached to sticks that were used for personal hygiene after using the toilet. The sponges were soaked in a water channel that ran through the latrine, and after each use, they were rinsed for the next person. Beyond just providing these sponges, the attendants had to ensure the latrines were cleaned regularly. They would manage waste removal, maintain the water supply for cleaning, and sometimes even help the more elderly or disabled bathers. While the role might seem quite mundane, it was vital to the smooth operation of the bathhouses and public spaces. The duties of the attendants were essential for the comfort and hygiene of Roman citizens, helping to maintain order in these popular gathering places. Interestingly, the role of the toilet attendant was also intertwined with Roman culture and their somewhat casual approach to bodily functions. Public latrines were not a source of embarrassment, and these attendants were a part of the social fabric, even if their work was seen as less glamorous. In some cases, there were specific supervisors of the latrines, and some toilet attendants may have held additional responsibility for ensuring the smooth operation of bathhouses in general. Although the job of the toilet attendant is long gone, it serves as a fascinating glimpse into Roman society's commitment to cleanliness and public hygiene. The Romans were among the first to design complex sanitation systems, and their public baths were some of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, influencing future generations of public health and hygiene practices. In the courts of medieval and Renaissance Europe, the royal beekeeper,
held a very specialized and esteemed position. This individual was responsible for maintaining the hives and bees that were kept in the royal palace or estate. Bees were of immense value, not only for their honey, which was a luxury product used in cooking, medicine, and even as a form of sweetener, but also for their wax, which was used in everything from candles to cosmetics. The royal beekeeper's duties went far beyond just tending to the bees. They were tasked with ensuring that the hives were healthy and productive. This required knowledge of bee behavior, hive management, and the seasonal cycles of honey production. The beekeeper would monitor the queen bee's health, ensure the hive was free from disease, and harvest the honey at the right time to avoid harming the colony. It was a delicate balance. Too much interference with the bees could result in a failed hive, while too little attention could lead to a decline in honey production. The role of the royal beekeeper was especially significant because of the symbolic and practical importance of honey and bees in medieval and early modern courts. Honey was often used in the making of mead, a popular alcoholic beverage among the elite, and beeswax was prized for its use in candle making, providing light in an age before electric illumination. The royal beekeeper was, therefore, a key figure in the production of luxury goods that were highly prized in royal circles. One of the more intriguing aspects of this role was its link to royal ceremonies. Bees were considered a symbol of fertility, prosperity, and the continuity of the royal lineage. As such, the royal beekeeper might be called upon to present honey or beeswax as part of ceremonial gifts or rituals. The bees themselves were thought to bring good fortune to the monarch, and there were even superstitions about the connection between the health of the bees and the well-being of the kingdom. Additionally, there was a rather odd but important duty that the royal beekeeper had to fulfill in some courts. They were the ones who would inform the king and the court if the monarch passed away. According to some traditions, if the king died, the bees would abandon the hive, signaling the end of the reign. The royal beekeeper was entrusted with this delicate task of notifying the royal family or the court, and sometimes it was the beekeeper who would be the first to tell the court of a monarch's death, as it was believed that the bees' behavior would give them an early warning. As time went on and beekeeping became more common, the position of the royal beekeeper gradually diminished in importance. With the rise of commercial beekeeping, these specialized roles became less common. However, the royal beekeeper's legacy lives on in the rich tradition of beekeeping, which still plays a crucial role in agriculture and the environment today. The history of the royal beekeeper reminds us of the intricate relationships between nature, culture, and royalty throughout history.